Okay, so the first step would be identifying the signs of each quadrant. So just keep in mind that the first quadrant would be positive, negative. The second quadrant would be negative, positive. The third quadrant would be negative, negative. And the last quadrant would be positive, negative. So the signs are really the only thing that change for the unit circle. And I'm going to do this in terms of radians just because you can easily figure out, convert radians to degrees, and we use radians more often. So the first thing is that is at the axes. So I always start with the 4 axes. So this is 0 or 2 pi. This would be pi over 2. This would be pi. And this would be 3 pi over 2. Since the radius is 1, the coordinate for this one would be 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. So then for figuring out within each quadrant, this first quadrant here, the first green line is your smallest fraction, so that would be pi over 6. And then the next largest one would be pi over 4. The last one and the largest fraction would be pi over 3. So for this one, the way that I remember, you can just memorize it if that helps you. But the small little trick that I have is that the first coordinate of each of these will have something to do with the denominator. So the first coordinate for pi over 6 is square root 3 over 2, and I can always remember that because 3 times 2 is 6. And the second coordinate would be 1/2. For the next one, it's pi over 4, and you have square root 2 over 2 because 2 plus 2 or 2 times 2 is 4. And this one, both coordinates are the same. And then the last one, 1/2 is the first one because 1 plus 2 is 3. And then it's just the opposite of pi over 6. So square root 3 over 2 would be the y coordinate. Now, all of these points stay the same around the circle. Their signs just change. So nothing too much really changes other than that. Keep in mind also that for all of these coordinates are important because the x coordinate is always your cosine of the angle and your y coordinate is the sine of the angle. As far as determining the names of the angles for each of these lines, I always remember ASAP. So each quadrant, A stands for all, meaning all of the denominators. S stands for subtract. A stands for add. And then P stands for prime. And what I mean by this is, so for example, in the second quadrant, all the denominators stay the same. So this one would be 6, this one would be 4, this one would be 3. And since this one is subtract, we would subtract 1. So this would be 2 pi over 3, 3 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 6. The next quadrant is to add. So this would be 7 pi over 6. This would be 5 pi over 4. And this last one, oops. This last one would be 4 pi over 3. And then lastly, we have prime. So it's going to go 3, 5, 7, 11, pi over 6, pi over 4, and pi over 3. Again, you could also just count and simplify all of the fractions, but this is a quick way to memorize that. Again, all of the coordinates stay the same. You just have to change the sign according to the quadrant that they're in.